Gandalf to mystifies.
Hi guys, V Gandalf coming back at you. It's been a while, so I'm really thrilled to have you join me again for a brief little discussion. I've been asked to kind of discuss some base networking concepts and wanted to just touch, I can't think of a better way to touch on base networking concepts than just cover the OSI model. And so let's go. I'm going to cover the OSI model. Some of you have probably heard of things like the 7-layer OSI model. So if I write down here 7 layers, a little whiteboard session, we talk about layer 2 networking and layer 3 networking and layer 7 firewalling and all this stuff. And what does it kind of mean? So we start with the 7-layer OSI model, which is physical, and there's a little mnemonic. Please do not throw sausage pizza away. That another one that gets used often is all people. I can't talk and write at the same time. I'm really just bad at that. Seem to need data processing. And they really aren't talking about people, really not talking about pizza, but they're talking about the first letter in each of these layers that are making up the idea of networking. Now, networking is basically about encapsulating the traffic that you're going to be working with. Now, for example, the physical layer is where bits and bytes take place. So I'll slide this over a little bit. I'll slide over a little bit, and we'll talk about bits and bytes. That really takes place the physical layer. And it's like electricity or light waves that get used to transmit these bits and these bytes. We talk about cabling, and our number one layer for troubleshooting is right here at physical. That's the number one thing that you have to worry with. Now, the data link layer, so all the networking that you see, and you've all seen pictures of networking that has to do with all these cables. I mean, there's been some unbelievable pictures. I'll put one up on the screen here. Now, if you look at that, you can see, oh my goodness gracious, look at all those cables. That's physical layer. Okay, that has a little bit to do with networking, and it's a big part of networking in a data center, but it's the physical part. Then we have the data link layer. Now, the data link layer is actually split into 2 sublayers called logical link control and media access control. Now, the logical link control is the software side of the data link network. Media access control, well, I bet you've heard of this before. The MAC address. That comes from the media access control sublayer of the data link layer. And MAC addressing would look something like this. If I don't write over my chair there. 00:50:56:56:56:44:52. Now, that's just a sample, and the format is different per vendor. You'll see some people separate it with hyphens. You see some people don't separate the little pairs at all. But that's the way a MAC address is written. The MAC address is the hardware address. It is generally hard-coded into the NIC that is communicating on the physical layer that's got a cable plugged into it. So that's the MAC address. All local networking, and I'm going to say this again, all local networking communicates from one MAC address to another MAC address. The source MAC address and the destination MAC address are within something called a frame that takes place to identify the collection of data that's encoded in bits and bytes within the construct of the frame at the data link layer. Now, what's incorporated into those bits and bytes will include the network. The network layer is all about separating networks. And the most commonly used network protocol today is IP. Oh, don't you mean TCP/IP? Hold that thought. The most common data link is Ethernet. Okay, we'll see others, but Ethernet is really the most common of the data link protocols. IP, Internet Protocol, is the most commonly used networking protocol. I mean, there was IPX, SPX, and NetBEUI, and all kinds of others that have sort of deprecated out, including, may I say, the network layer of the OSI model, right? That kind of deprecated. We've all gone to IP. And the IP address, you would see written something like, they call it dotted quartet, 10.1.1.1, and that would be an IP address that's associated with a particular host on an IP network. But it's not complete. What do you mean it's not complete? Well, I have a question for you. Do you think these two addresses are on the same network? Remember, this is the network layer, so we're separating our networks out. Do you think they're on the same network? Most of you are going to say, well, sure they are, because a very important networking address is called the subnet mask. And if both of these had what we call a /24 or 24 bits in the mask, that would separate this address into two parts. This would be the network part, and this would be the host part. Not with the 24, but the .1 and the .10. Those addresses would then be considered to be on the same network and would translate to the MAC address using a protocol called ARP, or Address Resolution Protocol. As I said, local addresses, they would be considered local addresses. And as local addresses, they would translate to the MAC address, and the destination would be MAC address to MAC address. Now, we'll get into much more detail when we talk about Layer 3 networking in another series, but consider it said that the network IP is determining the network that an address belongs to based upon the subnet mask that's assigned to that network. That's enough to go on for now. Let's talk about transport. Transport, I said I'll talk about TCP/IP. Well, TCP/IP, TCP is a transport layer protocol. And that transport layer protocol is used to ensure that we're making a connection before we start transmitting data. So we kind of include session in that as well, because it establishes, using a three-way handshake, a session that will be ongoing and will have numeric values associated with each of the packets that get built at the network layer to forward. And it's also assigning specific port numbers that identify the application that's going to be listening at the destination. Now, the brother of TCP is called UDP. And UDP is kind of the fire and forget protocol in the transport layer. The fire and forget protocol of UDP says, you know, I'm not going to require a three-way handshake to establish a session. I am going to fire this out there, and, you know, I'll just figure it gets there. I used to always compare that to the United States Post Office. And people always go, hey, you know, the post office is pretty reliable. Well, not everybody says that, but I do. And the idea is, in a classroom of 10 people, I ask how many, you know, letters or bills they get every month. And that's when we used to get our bills by mail. And they'd say, you know, 10, 12, 14. And if there's 10 people in class and everybody got an average of 10 pieces of mail a month, that'd be 100 pieces a month. And I'd say, how many of you in the last year have actually had a piece of mail get lost? And I'd usually see one hand or maybe two. And so out of 1,200 transactions, 1,200 pieces of mail, one got lost. That's pretty good. That would be an A in any class that you've taken, right? So UDP is considered an unreliable protocol, just like the U.S. Post Office is considered unreliable. Okay? It really isn't very unreliable if you get that kind of throughput. The advantage of UDP is a little less overhead. I don't have to go through a three-way handshake. I don't have to go through an acknowledgement of all the frames. So it's good for streaming stuff. You're watching me on a UDP transmission. Hopefully I'm still here. And you see everything that I write, because UDP is very good about keeping up. Sometimes my face might freeze. Sometimes you might see a U that gets written, but suddenly it appears. It's all right. It still gets the message across. Now, the session layer really combines in the TCP/IP protocol with the transport layer to establish the connectivity and tracking of the sessions that take place. Okay? So they actually end up calling this a socket that ties together the IP address and port number at the source and at the destination. That's referred to as a socket, and it allows for an application to continue talking. Now, presentation is where we sneak things in. Well, we decide, see if I can spell encryption. We decide and agree upon in the negotiation of this transmission to agree upon an encryption protocol, let's say. Maybe we'll be using some form, let's go way back, DES. You know, we'll agree upon some form of encryption. Usually we'd be using AES at this point in any network encryption that's taking place. So the advanced encryption standard, but that's agreed upon at the application layer, at the presentation layer, that the application has required. Now the application is really, well, maybe some of you have heard, that says application, may not look like it, but maybe some of you have heard of some of the protocols that exist at the application layer. HTTP, HTTPS, FTP, I could go on, DNS. All these are application layer protocols that utilize and send instruction to the presentation layer, choosing which transport layer to establish the session, identifying source and destination IP address for the transmission, choosing to use the local Ethernet protocol, and transmitting the bits and bytes for that network to take place on the physical medium. So that's when people talk about the 7-layer OSI model, that's the 7 layers that they're talking about. Okay? So that's as core and basic the networking components. If you got that understood, well, you've nailed it. Troubleshooting generally starts at the bottom. You generally look at the physical layer. Is it plugged in? Is there a link light on? Then you might go to the data link layer, where hardware, duplicate hardware addresses are very rare, if they're burned in especially. But in virtualization, we assign MAC addresses. Possibility exists that there could be duplicates. That would break your network. Network IP addresses and subnet masks with their default gateway, that's a troubleshooting thing that you'll need to address, because local uses ARP to go to the MAC address. Remote is going to forward to his gateway, his router. And you know what? By his MAC address. So the gateway has to be in the same network. And then the transport, session, presentation, and application protocols are used to encapsulate the actual application's data that's being forwarded. Anyway, that's just the bare basics when it comes to networking that takes place in every virtual network, logical network, physical network. All networking really boils down to that. I hope that was a little informative. Shoot me an email or a comment down below if you'd like further information on basic networking concepts. Thanks, guys. See you again real soon.
Be down off to Mr. Line.